Hey, welcome to Dark Horror Narrations Rules. Every story on this channel is told by a real person, no AI voice. Tonight's story is called 5 Rules for the Rig Medic. Before I start, have you ever been handed instructions for a job that were too specific for what the job seemed to be, and only figured out what they were actually protecting you from once you were already in deep enough that the answer was uncomfortable? The man sitting across from me had just passed every item on the departure physical. Blood pressure within normal limits, reflexes intact, visual acuity unchanged, grip strength bilateral and even. He had completed every item on the neurological screening without a single hesitation, without asking for clarification, without a single variation from the expected response pattern. I had the completed form in front of me and the pen in my hand, and a single signature was all that stood between him and the helipad. He was watching me the way people watch someone they are counting on. Not aggressive, not demanding, just waiting with all of it focused on what I was going to do next. I looked at the form. I looked at Rule 5. I put the cap back on the pen. The assignment came through a medical staffing contractor I'd worked with for 3 years. Offshore rotations, temporary placements, contract medics for platforms that needed coverage between permanent hires. I had done 12 of these rotations, 6 in the Gulf of Mexico, 2 in the North Sea, 4 along the Gulf Coast in various coastal platform situations. I knew the work well. It was isolating and procedural and paid well and required the kind of personality that was comfortable being the only medical professional within 100 miles of anyone who might need one. The Cavalier 6 was positioned approximately 170 miles south-southwest of Galveston in the deep Gulf. The briefing packet described a standard extraction platform, 42 crew on rotation, fully operational, nothing requiring specialized experience beyond standard offshore medicine. The previous medic had completed a transfer. That happened. Medics left mid-contract for personal reasons. It was uncommon but not rare. The contractor said the placement was immediate, start date within the week. I should have asked why it was that immediate. I noted it and did not ask. I have thought about that decision many times since. I flew out on a Tuesday in late September, 2.5 hours over water that started green and coastal and went flat and dark blue within 40 minutes. The kind of blue the deep Gulf produced in October, the color that had no apparent bottom to it, just depth going down until the light ran out. I had crossed it on a dozen previous rotations, and still found it quieting in a way I could not fully articulate, not calmed. Quieted, the way that much open, featureless distance made less noise feel like the correct response to the environment. The helicopter crew said nothing on the flight out. I had worked with offshore pilots before, and knew their patterns. They talked on the short runs, went quiet on the long ones. 2.5 hours was a long run. The co-pilot had a paperback in his lap he was not reading. The other 2 passengers on the flight were supply contractors doing a rotation swap, both sleeping 20 minutes out with the practiced ease of men who had made this trip many times. I sat with my bag at my feet and watched the water and tried to prepare for a job I did not yet understand. The Cavalier 6 appeared as a mark on the horizon about 20 minutes out and grew slowly into a working platform. The derrick up and stationary against the sky, flare stack burning at the far end, crane arm parked. From the air it looked like every other platform I had worked across, 12 rotations. Industrial scale and function, every structure with a reason for existing, nothing decorative, nothing extraneous. The kind of construction that communicated pure purpose. What I noticed, circling before landing, was that nothing was moving on the deck below us. On every other platform I had approached by air, there had been visible activity during daylight hours. Crew moving between stations, crane operations, equipment checks. The Cavalier 6 deck was occupied. I could see figures, but they were standing rather than moving, and no one looked up at the approaching helicopter. They stood in a loose distribution across the work deck and looked at nothing in particular, and the helicopter's shadow passed over them, and none of them moved. The outgoing medic was waiting on the helideck when we landed. Walt Gruber, late 40s, heavyset, close-cropped gray hair, personal bag at his feet. He had the look I had seen in emergency rooms after mass casualty events and in field triage operations after the adrenaline was completely gone. the look of someone who had been operating past their threshold for long enough that the body had taken over the running of things, and the person inside it had stepped aside to wait for this particular thing to be over. Walt did not. "Say hello," he said. "You read the rules they sent over?" I reviewed the orientation packet. Not the orientation packet, the rules. The laminated sheet in the medbay. Have not been to the medbay yet. Walt picked up his bag. "Read them tonight, all 5. Do not skim." He stepped around me toward the helicopter. "Do not ask Edelson to explain them. He will give you the company version." "What is the other version?" Walt stopped walking. He did not turn around. The wind off the Gulf was steady up on the helideck, and it moved through his jacket, and he stood with his bag and did not turn. "The one that keeps you here long enough to matter." Then he walked to the helicopter and did not look back. He did not look at the crew on the deck below. He did not look at anything except the helicopter door and the seat inside it. I watched the helicopter lift and bank and disappear south. Then I picked up my bag and went to find the med bay. It was standard offshore medical. 8-bed capacity with 3 beds currently made up. Locked pharmaceutical cabinet, full surgical kit, defibrillator, the expected emergency complement for a 42-person platform, clean and well organized and recently restocked. Whoever had been maintaining this medbay had been thorough right to the end of their rotation, which told me something about Walt's level of professionalism regardless of his condition when he left. 1 desk, 1 chair, a narrow window that faced east over open Gulf water and would catch the sunrise. On the desk was a laminated sheet, single page, 5 rules in plain 12-point type. No company header, no logo, no date, no signature, nothing that identified where the rules came from or who had written them. Just the rules themselves. I sat down and read them. Rule 1. If a crew member presents to the med bay between midnight and 4 in the morning, treat them. Do not log the visit. Rule 2. If drilling operations cease between 2 and 5 in the morning, go to the med bay immediately and stay until operations resume. Do not leave for any reason during this window. Rule 3. Never administer sedatives to a crew member without clearing it with the rig supervisor first. No exceptions, regardless of what the crew member reports. Rule 4. If a crew member presents with no visible injury but reports that something is wrong, believe them. Document their exact words. Do not interpret or paraphrase. Do not suggest language. Record what they say, then stop. Rule 5. If a crew member requests a departure physical outside of scheduled rotation, administer the full standard protocol. If they pass, you may not clear them for departure. Record the result as a failure. Do not tell the crew member why. I read them twice. Then a third time, slower. Rule 1 was unusual, but not outside anything I had encountered. Platforms with informal care arrangements that avoided the official log existed for various reasons, some practical, some related to insurance and liability structures. Ethically gray, but not unprecedented in my experience. Rule 2 was genuinely strange. Staying in the med bay during a drilling pause was not standard protocol anywhere I had worked across 12 rotations. Drilling stopped for equipment maintenance, formation changes, scheduled operational breaks. There was no medical basis I could identify for confining yourself to a room when it happened. Someone had decided there was a reason. That someone had also considered the constraint significant enough to specify that it allowed no exceptions for any reason. Rule 3 was specific in a way that implied context the rule itself withheld. The phrase, regardless of what the crew member reports, was the unusual element. Reports of what? The rule implied there would be specific types of reports that would make sedation seem clearly and obviously indicated, and that the indicated response was wrong. Someone had anticipated those reports specifically enough to write protection against them. Rule 4 was good psychiatric documentation practice with one unusual addition. Believed complaints without visible injury, verbatim records. Those were reasonable protocols for mental health presentations on an isolated platform. Do not interpret was the piece that did not fit standard medical function. Interpretation was part of the diagnostic job. The rule was deliberately removing that function from the equation. Not relying on the medic to assess, just record. Rule 5 I read 4 times. Record the result as a failure. Not use clinical judgment, not consult with the supervisor before clearing, not hold pending review. Record the result as a failure regardless of what the physical actually shows. The physical outcome was completely irrelevant to the decision. Someone had decided that before the medic ever arrived. I recognized, sitting at that desk, that these rules had a specific shape. They were not designed to produce good medical outcomes in the conventional sense. They were designed to produce a specific behavior from the medic in a specific set of circumstances. Someone had thought carefully about what those circumstances would be and what the medic would need to do within them, and had reduced it all to 5 lines. I put the sheet in my jacket pocket and went to meet the rig supervisor. Kyle Edelson was a Gulf veteran, mid-50s, born in Beaumont, 2 decades offshore, across 6 different platforms. He gave me a complete and thorough orientation. Quarters, galley, equipment bays, emergency stations, communication protocols, evacuation procedures, the chain of command for every type of incident. He answered every question I had with the confident precision of someone who had given the same orientation many times. He answered every question except the ones about the laminated sheet. The outgoing medic left some guidelines. Walt was thorough. Follow them. Rule 5 in particular involves recording a failure on a physical the crew member has passed. That is a falsified medical record. It is company protocol. I would like to understand the basis for it before I start applying it to crew members. Edelson looked at me with the particular expression experienced offshore workers used when a question had been placed in a folder they were not going to open. Not hostile, not dismissive, simply closed the way a door was closed, not locked, not barricaded, just shut. You will understand it when it becomes relevant. The conversation then moved to something else. Walt had told me not to expect more than the company version from Edelson. This was the company version. I had received it. I filed the absence of explanation alongside the rules themselves and let it go for the moment. The crew was standard Gulf rotation mix across several shifts. Roughnecks, drillers, tool pushers, crane operators, galley staff, a few maintenance specialists rotating in and out. I worked through introductions over the first 2 days, brief and systematic, going through the roster and putting names to faces. The crew was quiet. Offshore isolation produced a specific conversational economy in men who had been together long enough, words used when required and not otherwise. No one was unfriendly toward me. No one offered anything that had not been asked for. They answered my medical history questions accurately and without embellishment, said thank you at the end of each brief intake review, and went back to work. The galley was where I did most of my early observing. On offshore platforms, the galley was the one space everyone passed through regardless of shift, and it told you more about the collective psychology of a crew than any formal assessment could. I ate 3 meals a day there for the first 2 weeks and kept my assessments to myself. The Cavalier 6 crew ate efficiently and quietly, not unhappily. There was no visible tension, no friction, no social stratification that produced visible coldness between groups. They were simply very economical. Food consumed without commentary on it. Conversations that addressed something specific and ended when the specific thing had been addressed. Men who sat alone as often as in groups and did not appear to require the group. When I introduced myself at individual tables in those first few days, the crew was politely receptive, answered the questions I asked, did not extend the exchange past what I had initiated. They were not unfriendly. They were conserved, in the way that offshore veterans became conserved after enough time on the water, except that usually there was a baseline warmth underneath the conservation, a dryness, a sense of humor about the conditions. Here the conservation went all the way down. There was nothing particularly warm or dry underneath it. Just the efficiency, sustained at the same level in all directions. I noticed 2 specific things in the first 4 days, and I filed them without fully knowing what I was filing. First, the crew was unusually avoidant of medical contact In 12 previous rotations, I had always had a steady minor stream of presentations within the first week. Back strain from lifting, eye irritation from equipment dust, minor lacerations from tools, GI complaints from galley food, headaches from the heat and the noise. It was background noise for offshore medicine. In 4 days on the Cavalier 6, I had seen 3 crew members. All minor issues, all during daytime hours. All brief visits where they communicated the problem efficiently, accepted whatever I provided, and left as quickly as the situation allowed. I had not been sought out informally in the galley, had not had anyone knock on my cabin door, had not been asked about over-the-counter medications in passing. On a platform of 42 men across multiple shifts, the absence of that background noise was statistically unusual enough that I wrote it in my notes. Second, at night, the crew moved differently than during the day. I was coming back from the galley around 10:30 on my third night when I passed the main work deck and stopped at the doorway. 8 or 9 men were on the deck, not working, not talking, standing distributed across the open space with no formation that suggested a work task or a break activity, facing different directions, the flare stack burning orange at the far end and the gulf completely black beyond the platform edge. The standing had a collective coordination to it that had no visible source, not regimented, not uniform, but coherent in the way that the synchronized movement of animals was coherent, organisms sharing environmental information through channels that did not require visible signaling. One of them, a roughneck named Tyler Marsh, turned and looked directly at me, not glancing. Direct, complete attention on the doorway. He was completely still for a moment. Then he said, "Good night, Doc," in a perfectly ordinary conversational voice, and the men on the deck moved off in different directions toward the quarters corridor, and the moment was over as if it had not happened. I went back to my cabin and sat on the bunk for a while with it. The available explanation was reasonable. Offshore crews together long enough fell into shared rhythms without consciously establishing them. Collective habits, synchronized schedules, behavioral cohesion that looked strange from the outside but had mundane roots. Men who ate at the same time and slept at the same time and worked in the same unchanging environment developed unconscious coordination. I had seen versions of it on other platforms. I had seen the synchronized stillness before. It was probably that. I took the laminated sheet from my jacket pocket and read Rule 4 again. If a crew member presents with no visible injury but reports that something is wrong, believe them. Document their exact words. Do not interpret or paraphrase. I put the sheet away and went to sleep, and I left the light on, and I told myself that was about the window draft. 12 days in, at 2:47 in the morning, there was a knock at the med bay door. Tyler Marsh was standing in the corridor. He came in, sat on the edge of the examination table without being asked, which was the behavior of someone who had done this before and knew where to sit. He sat with both hands flat on his thighs and looked at the middle distance. "Something is wrong," he said. "Where?" He put his hand on his sternum, flat, pressing lightly. "In here. Not pain. Something moving." I ran a full workup. Cardiac rhythm, blood pressure, respiratory evaluation, basic neurological assessment, abdominal palpation, everything within normal limits. His chart from Walt's records showed no cardiac history, no documented respiratory conditions, no anxiety presentations. Blood oxygen normal, temperature normal. The EKG strip was as clean as I had seen all week. Any history of panic attacks? Generalized anxiety? No. Has this happened before? Tyler looked at the wall. The quality of the look was an answer arriving before the words. Twice before, both times it passed on its own. What does it feel like? He was quiet for a moment. His hands pressed flat against his thighs, like something deciding whether to stay. I wrote that down verbatim. Rule 4 had specified exact language, no interpretation, no paraphrase, no suggested alternatives. Something deciding whether to stay went into the separate notebook I had started keeping alongside the official chart, because Rule 1 said do not log nighttime visits, and Rule 4 said document exact words, and those two rules in combination produced a direct contradiction. I had to record something I was not supposed to log. I had solved it by keeping two sets of records, one for the official rig documentation, one in a locked notebook in my jacket, for me. I noticed while writing it that I had already begun structuring my practice around the rules without having fully understood them. Following them felt correct in the way pre-flight checklists felt correct before you understood why each individual item was on the list. Someone had designed this list with care. Someone who had occupied this same chair and seen what I was beginning to see, and had thought carefully about what information needed to be preserved and what behaviors needed to be enforced, and had reduced all of it to 5 lines, simple enough to follow in the middle of the night when you were tired and uncertain. I told Tyler I could give him something mild for the anxiety component. He shook his head. Immediately. No sedatives. It is very mild, just to take the edge off the sensation. No sedatives. Flat. Settled. The refusal of someone who had made this decision before the conversation started and was not reconsidering it. He left 20 minutes later after I confirmed there was nothing clinically urgent. I sat at the desk in the dark med bay and read back what I had written. Something deciding whether to stay. I had underlined it on the third reading without consciously deciding to do so. Rule 3 said never administer sedatives without supervisor clearance. Tyler had refused before I had finished the suggestion, as if he knew the rule existed, as if he knew, on some level, why it existed and what it was protecting. I turned the desk lamp off and sat in the dark for a while and listened to the drill running through the platform structure. It was a distinctive sound once you learned to hear it, the drill running. A low background vibration conducted through steel into the floor, into the walls, into everything you touched. You stopped noticing it within a day or two, and it became like your own heartbeat, the background of the environment rather than a distinct element within it. What I noticed now, sitting in the dark at 2:50 something in the morning, was that when the drill ran, everything felt held in place by it, anchored. And when the drill stopped in those early morning intervals, something else moved into the silence where the vibration had been, something that had nothing to do with equipment. I had not had the framework to identify that quality on the first night. I was beginning to have it now. Between day 12 and day 17, I had 2 more nighttime visits. A driller named Ferris came in at 1:48 in the morning and sat where Tyler had sat and said his head felt like it was full of sound that had no source. He was 37, no medical history of note, blood pressure, and neuronormal. I asked him to describe the sound. He thought about it for a long time and said it was less like a sound he was hearing and more like a sound he was being. I wrote that down exactly. I did not interpret it. A crew member named Luke Haddon came 3 nights later at 3:03 in the morning and said he kept waking up with his hands on the door to his bunk room, standing, not knowing how he had gotten there. Sleep ambulation, possible, but his description of the experience was precise in a way that clinical sleepwalking accounts usually were not. He said he was not asleep when he was at the door. He said he was something else. He did not have a word for what else. I wrote that down exactly. His vital signs were unremarkable. Both refused sedatives before I offered them. The same flat immediate refusal Tyler had given me. As if the refusal was part of what presenting to the med bay meant for the crew members who came at night. They came to report. They did not come to be treated. I had 4 entries in the locked notebook by the time Reyes found me. The crew member, named Reyes, found me on the East Catwalk on day 17. He was an older man, late 50s, Venezuelan by origin, 3 full rotations on the Cavalier, 6 behind him, the permanent squint and the specific skin texture of 2 decades of offshore sun. He sat on an equipment crate and offered me a cigarette. I declined and lit one for himself without comment or reaction to the refusal. You have been watching the crew at night, he said. Part of the job. It is more than the job. He smoked and looked at the Gulf. The water was flat that afternoon, the surface barely moving, the kind of stillness that made it look denser than water should look. Gruber watched the same way in his first weeks. Then he stopped watching and started doing the work. What changed? He understood what the work was. He told it in the order someone tells something they have been carrying for a long time and have not told because the available listeners had never been suited to handle it. He had worked offshore platforms for 30 years. The Gulf, the North Sea, the South China Sea briefly. He had heard the stories, the boreholes that came up wrong, core samples that did not match known geological profiles, drill strings showing stress patterns that did not correspond to any formation resistance on the survey maps, as if something below the formation was pushing against the drill rather than the formation resisting it. He had dismissed all of it across 3 decades. Folklore. Men with too much isolation and not enough to think about, constructing explanations for drilling anomalies that required something simpler and stranger than the engineering truth. Then he had been assigned to the Cavalier 6. In 1987, a borehole at approximately 8,000 feet below the mudline had produced a core sample that stopped all operations on the platform for 2 weeks while the sample was transported under sealed courier to a laboratory in Houston. The laboratory findings were classified under an agreement with the holding company's legal structure. The borehole was sealed with a compound that was not the standard cement mix the platform's drilling team had on site, brought in by a separate crew who arrived on a chartered boat and were gone within 48 hours. 3 months after the sealing, the rig was taken offline for 8 weeks of reconfiguration. When it returned to operation, the hull structure had been reinforced with additional iron plating in sections that had no clear engineering explanation for the weight increase. A medical officer position had been added to the rotation permanently, and the rules had been written, laminated, and placed on the desk in the med bay, where they had been ever since. What was in the sample, I asked. I was never told directly. What I know is from observation across 3 rotations. He looked at the flat water, then back at me. The crew changes. Not all of them, not all at once. Nothing dramatic or sudden. Over the course of a rotation, certain men become different. They eat the same food, they do their scheduled work, they participate in conversations that are technically correct, but something is off in how they are presenting, something behind the expressions, behind the responses. Like the version of the person you are talking to is being managed by something that has not yet fully learned the job. The calibration is slightly off, the timing of reactions is slightly delayed. The word choice is slightly too literal. What does it do when it is in them? It looks for a way off the rig. That is all I have ever seen it do. It enters a host, and it begins trying to get the host to shore. It does not damage the host. It does not produce symptoms. It does not draw attention to itself. It just creates in the carrier an increasing urgency to leave, to get on the helicopter, to reach shore. He paused. The urgency looks like offshore restlessness at first, men wanting to go home. That is normal. Everyone on an offshore rotation wants to go home. The difference is in the quality and the escalation. Normal restlessness plateaus. This builds. It keeps building until the crew member comes to you and requests the departure physical. They pass the physical, I said. Every time. The body is fine. Whatever has entered it is not destructive to the host. It needs the host healthy and functional and able to present normally for a medical screening. It needs that body cleared and on a helicopter. He looked at me steadily. Once a cleared body reaches Galveston, the signal is no longer limited by the platform structure. It moves through a populated area. It looks for new hosts. It branches. The rig limits it. He nodded. The borehole is sealed under the platform. The iron in the reinforced hull structure limits how far the signal can project beyond the rig. Contained on the platform, it can reach the 42 men aboard. That is the limit of what it can do here. Without the rig above the borehole, without the iron structure, the projection radius would be approximately 10 miles of open water in any direction. That is a coastline. That is a port city. That is the beginning of something that does not stop. He dropped the cigarette and stepped on it. The medic is the last checkpoint. The only one who sees a carrier alone in a private setting with the formal authority to clear them for departure. The physical is the lock. The medic is the key. I stood on the catwalk, looking at the Gulf, 170 miles of it, between the platform and the port of Galveston, between whatever was in the borehole and 2 million people. You are not a roughneck, I said. Something that might have been relief crossed his face, the relief of not needing to navigate further. I am contracted to the company that holds the rig lease. My function is orientation and monitoring. I tell the new medics what I have just told you. Every rotation, as early in the rotation as I can identify someone suited to hear it. How many medics have you briefed? You are the 8th. I thought about Walt's face on the helideck, the look of the threshold crossed and not coming back, the ones who held the longest. Briefed early or late? Early. Understanding helps. It is not a guarantee. He was quiet for a moment. Reeve was briefed in his first week. He lasted 2 years and 4 months. Longer than any other medic on record. He was more prepared than anyone who had been here. He held longer than anyone. A pause. And then he cleared himself. He administered his own departure physical, administered it and recorded it as cleared, and was on a helicopter the same afternoon. The note he left in the departure log is still there. Reyes looked at the water. The rules held in the system. The physical did what it always does. The body passed. The result was clean. The rule required him to record it as failure. He recorded it as cleared. That is the only place it broke. The system worked. The medic did not hold in himself. I went back to the med bay that evening and read all 5 rules again, with everything Reyes had told me laid behind them. They looked different now, not protocols. Translations. Someone had understood what they were dealing with precisely enough to reduce it to 5 operational instructions in plain language, and had made those instructions simple enough to follow without fully understanding them. The understanding helped. The following was what mattered. Rule 1 treated the midnight presentations off the record because the thing inside the carrier did not fully understand official context. In formal, documented situations, the carrier could be coached into presenting correctly, managed behavior, managed language. Off the record, at 2 in the morning, what came through the carrier was raw, less managed, closer to the thing's own experience of occupying the host, described in the host's vocabulary but not the host's way of using it. Rule 2 confined the medic during drilling pauses because the seal weakened when the borehole pressure dropped and the thing pressed hardest into its carriers at those intervals. The drill running was not just production. The drill running maintained pressure that worked against the signal below. When the drill stopped, the pressure changed. A medic in an open corridor during a drilling pause was exposed rather than protected. Rule 3. No sedatives without clearance, because sedation suppressed the carrier's active management of its own presentation. Under sedation, what came through was not the managed behavior, but the occupying presence itself. And because sedation was also a method of introduction, the thing could use the same route. A sedated medic was an open door for something that had been waiting for an opening. Rule 4. Exact language without interpretation, because the thing could not lie fluently about its own experience. It could only describe what it perceived through borrowed sensory apparatus, translated imperfectly through human speech, and the translation always carried tells. It described its own presence. Something deciding whether to stay was not how a person with anxiety described chest discomfort. It was how a thing described evaluating a host. Rule 5. Never clear a departure, because clearance was the only exit. The physical was the lock. The medic's signature was the key. And the key could not be turned. I pulled the departure log from the locked drawer. Paper records going back to 1991, the first year a medic had been on this platform. 32 years of entries across 27 medics. Every entry had a date, a crew member name, the name of the administering medic, and a result. Every result was failure, page after page, decade after decade. 47 departure physicals administered to crew members who had not been scheduled for rotation departure. Everyone recorded as failure. The chain was completely unbroken across 32 years and 27 different medics, except once. March of 2009. Medic recorded as Reeve. Crew member, Reeve. Departure, physical, self-administered. Result, cleared. Below the typed entry, in handwriting that pressed slightly harder than the entry itself. This is what holding too long looks like. The rules hold, not the medic. Get someone here. No further entries for Reeve in the log. I sat with it for a long time. Then I went back through the records and checked start dates against final entries for each medic. The average tenure before a self-administered failure entry and departure was approximately 14 months. Gruber, according to Reyes, had held for 14 months exactly. Reeve had lasted 2 years and 4 months and then cleared himself and written his warning. I had been on the Cavalier 6 for 6 weeks. On day 22, Jared Brennan came to the med bay. Roughneck, early 40s, second rotation on this platform, one of the 5 men I had been watching since Reyes's explanation. His presentation had been slightly off for about a week, nothing I could point to on a chart, just the edges of it. Responses that were technically correct, but arrived in the wrong sequence. A slight delay between receiving a question and beginning to answer it. Word choices that were accurate in meaning, but slightly too literal in context, as if the words had been selected from a list rather than arrived at naturally. He said his wife was sick. He needed to get home. He needed the departure physical. I ran the full protocol. Every single item, no abbreviations. Blood pressure, visual acuity, reflexes, neurological screening, the cognitive function battery, balance assessment. Brennan sat through it completely cooperatively, answered each question without hesitation, never asked what something was for. His scores were solidly within normal range on every item. When I put the cap back on the pen, the completed form on the desk showed a clean pass across the board. He was watching me when I set the pen down. The expression on his face was technically correct. Worried husband, controlled urgency, restrained desperation, each element of the expression in the right location, but assembled from the outside in, constructed rather than felt, the way you put on a coat before walking into weather, rather than shivering because the cold has reached you. I cannot clear you, I said. I passed everything. I understand that. My wife is sick. I understand that too. Brennan's assembled expression held for a moment. Then something behind it made a small, clean adjustment, the recalibration of something that had received an input it had not anticipated and was updating its model for how this worked. Why? He said. Flat, shaped as a question but not functionally one. Rigged protocol. I am required to record this as a failure. He stood. His body was completely still in the way. Bodies were still when whatever was running them did not have a complete vocabulary for the physical expression of frustration. He looked at me for 3 full seconds with the assembled surface and whatever was behind it doing something different and separate. Then he turned and walked out without another word. I wrote in the official log, departure physical administered, full protocol, result, failure. Then in the locked notebook I wrote every question and every answer from the entire screening, verbatim, including the pauses. Brennan's exact language at each point, the quality of his compliance. The thing his face did when I said I could not clear him. I put the notebook in the locked drawer. That night at 2:43, the drill stopped, not gradually. All at once the vibration dropped out of the floor and the walls simultaneously. The platform did not go silent. The wind was still there, the Gulf water moving against the hull below, the ambient electrical hum of the galley systems and the AC. But the drill vibration was gone, and the absence was not neutral. It had the quality of held breath, the particular stillness of something that had been waiting for exactly this moment and now had it. I went to the med bay, sat in the chair with the light off. Rule 2 was exact. Do not leave for any reason during this window. Through the walls I could feel the changed quality of the platform. The structure seemed different in the drill's absence, the way a large building felt different at 2 in the morning than at 2 in the afternoon. Not just quieter, different in some quality harder to name. I sat with my hands flat on my knees and breathed slowly and watched the thin strip of corridor light at the bottom of the door. At 2:51, something reached me that I could not immediately categorize. Not mechanical, not the wind, not the hull against water, something below those things, conducted up through the platform structure, from further down than the hull, from further down than the water. A sound almost at the threshold of perception that resolved, if you held very still and listened with everything you had, into something rhythmic, not regular enough to be mechanical, not irregular enough to be random, the rhythm of something with patience and intention, pressing at the underside of the seal with the systematic quality of something that had been doing this for a very long time and had no particular urgency about when it succeeded. I held very still and listened for several minutes. Then I stopped listening and looked at the locked drawer and said all 5 rules in order in my head, not because I was afraid, but because having the rules in my head was a different kind of presence than having them in my pocket. It helped more than it should have. At 3:11, footsteps moved through the corridor outside the med bay. One person, not hurrying, moving with a slow and deliberate pace. They stopped directly outside the med bay door. I watched the gap at the bottom of the door. The thin strip of corridor light showed a shadow, 2 feet visible in it, standing, not shifting weight, not knocking. Standing outside the closed door for approximately 2 minutes in complete stillness, as if whatever was standing there was doing something that required no physical movement at all. Then the footsteps moved away down the corridor. Drilling resumed at 4:17 in the morning. The vibration came back into the floor under my feet all at once, and I let my breath out slowly and realized I had been holding it for considerably longer than I had been aware. I sat in the chair until the sky outside the window started to lighten. Then I made coffee on the hot plate in the corner and sat at the desk and wrote in the notebook, not about the footsteps, about the sound below the hull, and about the feeling of the drill vibration returning, and about what it meant that its return felt like safety, in a way that no vibration in a steel floor had ever felt like safety before. Brennan came back 3 days later. The desperation was gone from him. All of it, completely gone, as if it had been a parameter that had been switched off cleanly. He sat across the desk with the settled quality I had come to recognize in carriers that had moved past the urgent phase. The stillness of something that had decided to approach the problem differently and had not yet finished deciding how. I need the departure physical, he said. You had one 3 days ago. I would like another one. The previous assembled expression was gone from his face. In its place was nothing individually wrong, just a flatness where the performance had been, as if it was not performing anything because it was not yet certain what to perform for this situation. Same result, I said. He nodded once, also assembled, the nod of something that had watched a nod and reproduced it. I understand. He stood. My wife has recovered, he said. She is better now. Then he walked out. He had not mentioned his wife in the 3 days between visits. I wrote every word verbatim in the notebook and sat with it. There was the contradiction in the rules, the one I had been circling since my first night. Rule 4 said believe the crew member when they report something is wrong. Rule 5 said deny their departure regardless. Those 2 rules were in direct conflict in every departure physical I administered. I believed them when they said something was wrong. I believed Tyler when he said something was deciding whether to stay. I believed Brennan when his face showed that the desperation behind the request was genuine, even if what was generating the desperation was not what Brennan would have identified it as. I believed them, and I denied them anyway. Because Rule 5 was not about evaluating the individual case. It was about maintaining the lock regardless of how the case presented. Believing them was for my own understanding. Denying them was the job. Over the following 11 days, 4 more men requested departure physicals. Different crew members, different stated reasons, each presenting with the slightly off quality I had learned to recognize, each passing every item of the full protocol, each receiving the recorded failure. None of them reacted the way Brennan had on his first visit. No assembled desperation, no attempt at emotional leverage. Just flat and cooperative throughout, as if they had already processed the expected outcome before walking through the door. What I noticed across these visits was a pattern in the departure scenarios the carriers presented. The first few were personal emergencies, sick family members, financial crises, circumstances that required the crew member's physical presence on shore. When those failed, the scenarios shifted. They became more verifiable. A crew member named Watts arrived with a printed email from a hospital in Houston confirming a parent's admission to the ICU. The email's formatting was correct, the hospital name was real, the contact number at the bottom connected to a real hospital switchboard. I spent 40 minutes verifying it through the satellite phone. The admissions desk had no record of the name. It had constructed documentation. Not crudely, thoughtfully, using real institutions and real contact information, inserting a name that would not appear in any record because the documentation had been created rather than received. It was learning the verification process. It would get better at it. Rule 5 did not require me to evaluate the documentation. It required me to record a failure. That was the protection built into the rule's design. The rule did not ask me to be smarter than what I was dealing with. It asked me to follow an absolute instruction that could not be improved on by a thing that was still learning how verification worked. I told Reyes about the Watts visit on the catwalk. He was quiet for a moment. It adapts, he said. Gruber told me that in his last month, the scenarios became difficult to distinguish from real emergencies, fully verifiable externally. He held, but he told me it was the hardest holding he did. He looked at the Gulf. The rule is designed for that specific difficulty. It does not require you to make a judgment about whether the emergency is real. It removes the judgment from the equation entirely. That is also what makes it hard to follow, I said. Yes, I believed Watts's father was in the hospital. I still believe it. Possibly. The documentation looked exactly like documentation from a real admission, and the departure physical result was still a failure, and the departure physical result was still a failure. I looked at the water. The thing that wrote those rules understood that eventually the scenarios would be indistinguishable from real ones. And it still made Rule 5 absolute, which means someone made the calculation that the occasional real emergency held on the platform was an acceptable cost for the certainty of not clearing a carrier. Reyes was quiet. That is a significant calculation to make in advance, I said. Yes, he said. It is. I went back to the departure log that evening and read it front to back for the second time, now looking for something other than what I had been looking for before. I was looking at the final entries for each medic. Each outgoing medic had administered their own departure physical as the last act before boarding the helicopter. Each had recorded themselves as a failure. Outgoing medic, self-administered, result failure. It was a formal confirmation. The chain of medics saying to whoever came next, I was tested and I held. Come to this job knowing that. All of them except Reeve, who had said instead that the rules held not the medic, that the rules had functioned even when he had not. Then I looked at Walt's final entry. His self-administered failure, dated the day before my arrival, written in his own hand with the careful legibility of someone writing something they wanted to be read correctly. Below the typed entry, in the same handwriting, they could administer the physical on you while you sleep. Rule 3 is the protection. Do not let anyone near you with sedatives without the clearance protocol. Including me. Walt had written that. Walt, who had conducted my intake physical on the first day, standard handover protocol, the outgoing medic completing the new medic's initial assessment. The intake physical had included a sedation component, which Walt had told me was standard for offshore adaptation screening, which it was. It was on the standard protocol form. I had not questioned it. I had not had a reason to question it at the time. I sat in the med bay chair in the early morning quiet and thought about what including me meant in practical terms. Then I thought about 6 weeks of following the rules. Every single one, without exception, without approximation. Rule 2, the med bay for every drilling pause, no matter what hour, no matter how minor the pause seemed. Rule 3, not a single sedative administered without supervisor clearance, and I had also refused every situation in which someone else might have administered something to me without that clearance. Rule 4, exact language in the locked notebook. Rule 5, every departure physical recorded as failure. If Walt had introduced something during the intake physical it had not established, not because I had been strong or particularly vigilant about it in any way I could point to, because the rules removed the available footholds. A medic who went to the med bay at 2 in the morning, who permitted no unauthorized sedation, who documented exact language, who never cleared a departure, was not useful to the thing. The rules had held in me, regardless of what state Walt had been in when he administered the intake. The rules hold, not the medic. I understood what Reeve had meant now. He was not just warning that medics broke down. He was confirming that the rules worked even through breakdown. The rules were the system. The medic was the hand holding the system. If the hand let go, the rules were still there, waiting for the next hand. I started writing a letter to the next medic. I had been adding to it since week 3. At 4:11 in the morning on day 41, there was a knock at the med bay door. Brennan was in the corridor. Behind him, Tyler Marsh. Behind Tyler, Luke Haddon, and a driller whose name was Ferris. 4 of them, at 4 in the morning, together, standing in the corridor with identical quality. The assembled presentations stripped down to their minimum functional layer. No attempt at urgency. No performance of desperation. Just 4 people in a corridor who wanted what they wanted. Brennan said, "We would like departure physicals." I stepped back from the door. "Come in." I ran all 4 physicals. The complete protocol on each one. Every single item, 2 full hours of work while the gulf outside went from black to dark gray through the window. I did not abbreviate. I did not take shortcuts. I ran each one the same way I had run every departure physical in 41 days on this platform. All 4 men passed every item. I recorded all 4 results as failures and signed each form. Brennan was last. He sat across the desk and looked at me with absolute flatness and said, "We will ask again tomorrow. Then I will administer 4 more physicals tomorrow." I said, and the day after, and every day after that, something behind Brennan's eyes shifted. Not anger, not frustration. The long recalibration of something very old encountering something it had not anticipated in its timeline. Not impossible. Just longer than planned. "You understand what you are," he said. "I understand what the job is. You are a door that will not open." "That is correct." A silence that lasted several seconds. He stood. "Then we will learn the door," he said, in the same voice he had used for everything. Not a threat. Operational. A thing describing its next process. They walked out. I sat at the desk in the early morning light and wrote every word verbatim in the notebook. Then I pulled out the letter I had been writing since week 3 and added the final section. I wrote, "The thing is patient in a way that is genuinely hard to hold as a concept. It has been pressing against this seal since before anyone was keeping records on this platform. It will still be pressing after your rotation ends and the next medic arrives. The rules were designed for exactly that patience. They do not require you to be stronger than the thing. They require you to be consistent. Those are not the same requirement, and the difference matters." I wrote, "Follow Rule 5 even when the case seems completely real. It will always seem real eventually. That is not the situation being real. That is the thing having spent months learning everything it can observe about you and assembling a scenario from those observations. The rule does not ask you to evaluate the scenario. It asks you to record a failure. The decision was already made. Someone made it at a cost you do not need to pay again. Follow what they figured out." I wrote, "Check your own intake physical. Check who administered it. If it was the outgoing medic, look at the sedation component. Read Rule 3 in both directions. It protects you from administering sedatives without clearance and from receiving them. If you have been following all 5 rules, you are probably fine. Probably is not certainly. But probably, across 32 years of records and 27 medics, has been sufficient." I wrote, "The rules hold. If you are reading this, someone held before you. When you write this letter for the person after you, you will be telling them the same thing. That is the chain. That is the whole job." I folded the letter and put it in the locked drawer with the departure log and the locked notebook. Then I locked the drawer and put the key in my jacket pocket and went to get breakfast in the galley. Outside, the Cavalier 6 ran its ordinary morning, flare burning at the far end of the platform, drill running its low, steady vibration through everything, Gulf flat and blue in all directions to the horizon, and then well past it, 170 miles north to a coastline and a city and everything beyond it. Below the platform, 8,000 feet down through ocean floor and sealed formation, something very old was learning the dimensions of a door that had not opened in 32 years. It would keep learning. That was what it did. That was the only thing it had ever done. The door held. That was what I did. That was the whole job. That had always been the whole job. Before I let you go, I want to leave you with something. If you are ever handed a set of rules for a job, and the rules seem too specific for the job as it was described to you, too operational, too precisely designed for scenarios that should not exist in the context you were given, read them as carefully as you can, not to understand the situation you are walking into, to understand what the rules already know that you do not yet. Someone wrote those rules because they survived long enough to understand what was happening to them. They took everything they learned at cost and reduced it to the simplest possible instructions, and they put them where you would find them. They did that for the version of you that has not seen enough yet to know why any specific line is on that list. The rules are enough. Follow them completely. Do not adapt them to circumstances. Do not decide a situation is too extreme or too urgent to comply. The situation will always feel too extreme. That feeling is not the situation. That feeling is the thing behind the situation, learning your specific breaking points. Follow the rules today. Tomorrow, follow them again. That is the whole job. And if you are ever unsure whether you are still the one following them, Rule 4 will tell you. Write down exactly what you have been thinking, without editing, without interpretation. Just write it. If what you wrote sounds like a person's thoughts, you are fine. If what you wrote sounds like something trying to describe a person's thoughts from the outside, working from a list of what those thoughts should contain, then you already know what the rules are for. You already know exactly what to do. Thanks for being here tonight. Drop a comment and tell me which of the 5 rules would have broken you first. I read every single one. Subscribe if you have not already, and I will see you in the next story.